Okay, great. Welcome everyone to today's webinar from the ETI and the Centre, which is focusing on emerging circular supply chains and approaches to safeguarding child and human rights. So we've got quite a packed agenda for today. Thanks all of you for joining us. In a second, we'll pass across to a brief welcome from Giles, who's the Executive Director of the ETI. We'll then hear some insights from colleagues at the Centre for Child Rights and Business, setting the scene, as it were, and also kind of going into some recent work that we've done focused on waste and recycling value chains from different perspectives. We're then going to have a bit of a fireside chat where we will hear from a number of speakers that we have with us today, going to a few more of the themes in a bit more detail. And then we'll round up with an opportunity for you to pose questions to all the speakers. So you can do that throughout the webinar by using the chat function that you see at the bottom of your screen. Just a few quick housekeeping things. Today's session is being recorded. It's a public webinar, so we're not using Chatham House rules, and things that you say may be quoted. So that's obviously for the speakers, but any other participations via chat questions, etc. Please use the Q&A function, sorry, not the chat function. So the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screens, to ask questions and share reflections throughout. So if you think of questions, then pose them, and then we can get back to them when we go to the Q&A section and put them to the panelists. So great to see people joining. And I think with that, okay, so next up then, do we have Giles with us, or shall I continue with the
I'm here. I'm here.
wonderful?
It's embarrassing to have this level of tech check, but I'm delighted to be here, Mark. Thank you. I wanted just to say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, massive thank you to everybody for coming and joining. This is a really important issue. It's only going to get more salient, I think, for so many organizations. We all know that economies are changing. I think what's so challenging and exciting about the opportunity about circular supply chains is how much at the moment there are opportunities really to improve so much in the way they work. So much of the work within them is manual, is informal. You know, just take clothing alone. You've got sorting, reselling, you know, all those processes, recycling, and there is a real opportunity here for us to establish, I think, working together, understandings about the critical challenges, and then really start to build on that over time about how we work together to address them. So I'm really pleased that we've got this session. And we've got very, very good speakers. Just briefly about ETI. For anyone who doesn't know, founded just over 25 years ago. I guess back when, in those days, there were stories just coming out about sweatshop supply chains, and we're now the successors to that movement in a much broader understanding of how supply chains work. ETI is tripartite, which is really pretty unique. What it means is we are made up of NGOs, trade union members, and company members. And the way our governance works is there's equal stakes for those organizations on our board, which is our decision-making body. But we're fundamentally here to drive progress. So to provide advice, guidance, and implementation on human rights due diligence in line with the UN guiding principles. But we're also fundamentally a place where we try and bring together people to act collectively on the issues which even large organizations struggle sometimes to address on their own. And I think this is a really good example about where we need everybody leaning in. So if we, I think I pass back to you, Mark, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Giles. And yeah, quick introduction from our side as well then. So the Centre for Child Rights and Business, very briefly, we're a global not-for-profit organization. Our core focus is on working with companies to respect and improve the conditions for children in global supply chains. We have very much a global team now, operating across Asia and other parts of the world that you see on the map. We're really pleased to work with a large number of ETI members, of course, as well as other companies around the world. And our focus area really is providing services, support, and consultancy to really support companies to improve supply chain transparency in relation to child rights and human rights, strengthen corporate practice, as well as address other challenges in your supply chain. So there's a broad range of other areas of work that we focus on in relation to worker well-being, child labour prevention, remediation, etc. We also do quite a lot of research on terms of child rights and human rights issues, and that's what we'll be some of which we'll be sharing today. But great to have the opportunity to partner with ETI in today's webinar. And I think with that, it's back to you, Giles. Or rather, Ines, I feel.
I think it's Ines, which is good news for everybody else because she is much more authoritative than I am. So over to you, Ines.
Thank you so much. And I'm not so sure about that, but thanks everyone. Delighted to be here. And I just wanted to quickly double check because I know sometimes with Zoom and if you're used to Teams, in case you don't see the slides, it's because you need to change the screen on top. And I know that has happened to others. So just in case of any of the participants, there are some slides. If you want to look at them, just go on the tab on top that says Ellen Schieblitz screen, and then you will see them. Yes, so to just starting off, we wanted to set the scene a little bit and give a bit of context. So first, here are kind of two definitions of what circular economy, circular supply chains, what that means. And I think these two definitions are quite far apart. You have one from the UNE, the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, and there's particular finance initiative, and where circular economy is defined as transformative approach that prioritizes reduction, reuse, refurbishment, and recycling of products. And the definition from the World Economic Forum is much more limited, where it says it's one particular company that never leaves their product out of sight and ensures and the materials out of sight and have them fully in control. So one is a very much more general understanding of, we're making sure that we are reducing, reproducing, and another one is we are really in entire control of our materials, our products, and make sure they're being used in a circular fashion. I think we today agree that it's anything from both sides that we want to talk about and that we want to look at. So it's not a very close definition of what we mean with circular economy. I think the importance obviously here is the element of materials not being wasted, materials not polluting, materials getting back into the supply chains, and how that is done. There is a huge demand for circularity, and I'm not going to go into detail, but I think we can see them in different countries across the globe. There's different strategies, and these are just a couple of examples, different strategies on how to push for circularity. So the market is definitely here, but there's a big but, and we can go to the next slide with that. So we, in the last couple of years, and we'll bring some two more detailed examples in a minute, and Gayang, our director of research, will share those examples. But some general challenges that we have observed is that a lot of times circularity initiatives within a company, and also big companies, are kind of niche efforts. So there's a little project that we are launching now. We're having one or two products where we're really ensuring circularity, or maybe we have 10% of our production that ensures it, but it often remains separate from the mainstream production that is being organized, put forward, or the products are being put forward. And that mainstream a lot of times does not consider circularity in its designs. That's circularity often is an afterthought or a side effect, because some materials are valuable, but it's not considered within designs of the products. We also know that companies often have lack of visibility, both upstream, so where the products and the materials and their origins are coming from, as well as where it's going, as well as downstream. And so that lack of visibility makes it often much harder for companies to really actually guarantee circularity, besides those niche projects that they might be organizing. in my original slide, this word intention had a question mark. I do think a lot of times it's not intentional that we, but the complexity of supply chains is, I think, does often feel very overwhelming for companies. And then we just opt to ignore those waste moments. So we ignore those moments on, for example, during the manufacturing process, we're creating waste and we're just ignoring what's happened with that waste because we're already overwhelmed generally in managing our supply chains, or we are ignoring where products are going at the end. And then lastly, and obviously related to all those points that I just mentioned, there's a lot of times we see that where there is circularity efforts, that they're being done kind of as an add-on, and they're not considering the existing recycling industry that is already out there. And particularly from our perspective as a child rights organization, that's where we see a lot of the challenges and a lot of the problematic or the problems coming in, because there is an existing workforce out there. There are millions of people who are in the recycling industry, who make their living by recycling goods. And they actually do an enormous, to us all, an enormous favor already by the amounts that are getting back into the production. And it's those people that we really have to kind of consider when we go forward. And I think that point Gayang will now make as well when she's sharing a bit of the findings we have from those two studies. So over to Gayang. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you, Ines. And thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I do realize we are running behind already, so I will, for some slides, I might fly them over a little bit, but please do leave in comments in the chat if you have questions. But yes, as Ines mentioned, we want to showcase two studies that we've conducted with UNICEF, and it's really looking at upstream waste and downstream waste. And as Ines mentioned, there's reasons that we're seeing these issues. Is this lack of circular production design and the lack of extended producer responsibility commitments. And we'll share a little bit of the studies that we found. Both are in Bangladesh, unfortunately, but it's because there's so much opportunity as a sourcing country from Bangladesh. So as we all know, textile manufactured textile is the second most polluted industry, and Bangladesh is the second largest textile producer. Unfortunately, it is one of the largest producers in textile waste, and only 5% is being recycled. So one of our study was to look into this 5% and how is this waste being recycled. Next, please. And frankly, this circularity is not driven by corporate brands. Unfortunately, it's driven by the informal sector and small businesses. So what we're seeing, this is a very simplified supply chain that we mapped in our study. What you can see is that we were focusing on post-industrial waste, which is pre-consumer. It's actually waste, we call it waste textile scraps, which are being manufactured. It's actually waste being produced at the manufacturing stage. And often in our assessments, what we looked at is that this waste is being outsourced to manage. It's not being recycled within the factories. And there's a range of reasons. And one of them is just it's the lack of infrastructure, the lack of know-how, and the skilled workforce, and etc. But what happens is that when this leaves the factory, it becomes very limited in terms of visibility and how many actors are actually involved in this supply chain. So what we actually saw is that there's so many. It was very fragmented in terms of the informal side of the recycling. We found that workers were working in substandard conditions. And unfortunately, it comes with unsafe environment. They're working below minimum wage. It's a low-skilled job, so it does attract child labor. And because of the lack of formal employment arrangements, and these workers lack the social protection. And while some workers that we've talked to, they are at these jobs for years because this is only skills. It's a very low skill, and then therefore they don't have access to decent work. So, for example, in one of the showcase in the picture you saw is that these workers in the shedding workshop who collects and shed, and they may do multiple tasks. His wages was $55 a month. So you can see how hard it is for them to have sustainable livelihoods. Sorry, next, please. And so that's the, I know we did this in a bit of a whiz, but just to let you know, that was some of the consequences when that waste is being outsourced. Now, the other interesting example we did, as I mentioned, was still in Bangladesh, but this is lead acid battery. And when we saw the lack of commitment to extended producer responsibility, it really had a severe impact on the human rights down the supply chain and in its community. Lead acid battery actually famously has one of the highest recycling rates, or can be, has the highest potential for recycling rates. It's supposed to be 99% is being able to recycle back to a new lead acid battery. But when we looked further into this, there's a real stark difference between the recycling practices between the global north and the global south. Next, please. What we saw that the circularity really requires a supportive regulatory supportive regulatory and economic environment. For example, lead acid battery in the global north can be a closed loop circularity, circular supply chain. Unfortunately, in the global south, such as Bangladesh, that is not happening. And it's because we saw that there's these gaps. And what we did through our research from desktop to some of our assessments is that it'll be surprising to see some of these statistics. Bangladesh actually has a very high amount of used lead acid battery. We call them ULAB. And it's generating approximately over 100 tons, metric tons a year. And ironically, it's been driven by this shift towards green energy, e-rickshaws, solar homes, and that's have been allowing this industry to thrive in Bangladesh. But due to its lack of regulations in recycling, the lack of governance over the producer in collection back of the used leaded acid batteries, we saw an enormous growth in illegal recycling. And through a lot of literature, it states that the recycling of ULABs is actually 90% by the illegal recycling processes. Next, please. So what happens when the green energy ignores the human rights? So we have chosen one of the examples that we saw, that we read, that we delved into is the Solar Home Program. It's a very famous Bangladesh program. It's one of the largest national solar home programs in the world, and it's funded by World Bank. It had all the things in place. It had all the policies in place. It's fantastic in terms of it installed over 4 million units. It powered energy for 20 million people in the rural Bangladesh. However, the whole focus was very much on the producer of the lead acid battery. The recycling part was unfortunately ignored, despite there were policies that producers need to have to collect back. But in reality, that fell through. And you can see that in practical, that only 3 formal recycling services were available for over 2,000 homes. Therefore, we saw this informal recycling happening in Bangladesh. And that unfortunately exposed children to a hazardous work environment with lead contaminations. There's evidence of child labor being used in these informal workforce because of battery breaking allows their work is their children is kind of can be useful in that sense for some workshops. And when illegal practices are happening in place, there are also lack of health and safety standards, which including having lead contamination into soils and therefore pollution into soil and leaching into food source. Next, please. So what you can see is that it's a huge problem, and UNICEF Bangladesh is working hard with the governments to solve this issue around lead poisoning. And lead poisoning is led by other things as well, so not just lead acid battery, but lead acid battery is definitely one of the pathways. Bangladesh is actually ranked 4th in terms of children being exposed to lead poisoning. That equates to 35 million children having high levels of lead in their bloodstream. Pregnant women are also at risk. And also this is impacting 31 lives a year in Bangladesh. So you can see how much that has impact on them in terms of not just socially, but economically. Next, please. So circularity is really important when it's being designed, that's to leave no one behind. And when you think this through around, especially in the sourcing countries in the global south, you have 60% of workforce are often employed informally. And what we found is that they often do operate in these circular supply chains, especially in the recycling and the waste management. I mean, and it's because really, frankly, it's cheaper labor. Companies are trying to bypass some red tape because sometimes it's quite bureaucratic to set up facilities. There's really lack of a bit of know-how as well, not just from a technology point of view, but as well as the having appropriate infrastructure investment. And then there's just a lack of oversight and the motivations for companies to have that extended producer responsibility. Next, please. But what we found when we talked to these workers at the waste markets or waste collection points is that they do see it as an opportunity for them. It's a way for them to have some kind of livelihood. Of course, it comes with a cost, and then we can only make this an opportunity for the informal workforce if only the supply chain can recognize these gaps that the informal workforce fills, to really identify the opportunities to improve their working conditions. And it's also about this better integration of informal workforce into the whole supply chain. This doesn't mean that it needs to formalize, and we'll talk a little bit that when we have some fire chat discussions, but it means that there is definitely a requirement and effort to have better integrations. And which does mean that there needs to be some creative and innovative solutions to allow allow this integration to happen. So sorry for kind of feels a bit quick for some of the hard and heavy facts around the two supply chains that we looked into. But yes, I'm happy to talk more if later and also separately after the event as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Guiyang. Really interesting insight. So now we're going to then pass across to the fireside chat section of today. So really pleased to be joined by some great speakers. So we have Nin Castle, who's co-founder of Reverse Resources, which is a global platform for textile to textile recycling. We've got George Williams, who's just transitions advisor at the ETI. We have Anne Deluda, who's environmental specialist at Mr. Price Group. Mr. Price Group is a major South African retailer with stores in other African countries, and of course Guiyang as well, who you've just heard from the centre. So to get started then, and just before I do, reminder that please do post your questions in the Q&A section to our panelists, but just to get the conversation going, I'm going to, Guiyang, actually start with you. So you've already highlighted some of the challenges from the research in relation to transparency, the challenges that come from that, but also I think you've also highlighted the critical, that workers' livelihoods really do depend on waste recycling activities within value chains in various different ways. So could we firstly just get your perspectives on what kind of risks companies face if they continue to exclude informal workers from circular strategies?
Sure. Thank you, Mark. To be honest, the biggest risk is that you don't have a sustainable supply chain. And that really range from human resources to sourcing materials to even carbon footprint. So because when we look at the textile waste, for example, you see the missed opportunities from turning that waste into value. And then having that trend of growing of demand for recycled yarn and recycled materials that they have to end up sourcing it from elsewhere. So that puts them in a lot of operational risk when they don't know when, they have to actually source it and etc. But for brands, to be honest, there's quite a number of risks, but one of the key ones that I want to highlight that I understand that CSDDD is still in discussion about the scaling back of the CSDDD. But I think it's important to remind everyone is at this moment is still supposed to be enforced even with a delayed timeline. And within CSDDD, it does require corporates, especially of European companies, to look into the raw materials that they're sourcing from. And if the material is a recycled material, then that is part of the corporate's responsibility to understand the supply chain and not to exclude how the informal workforce are being supporting the supply chain. And there's so much more, but I'm sure other speakers might have some more to add. So I'll let the other speakers also add into that too.
Thanks so much, Gayoung. And then, Andile, if I can turn to you, your company's doing some quite interesting work in terms of bringing plastic waste back into the circular supply chain. Can you tell us a bit more about that in terms of circularity?
Right, thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to this fireside chat. So in Mr. Price Group, sustainability is one of the key strategic pillars, and therefore there's an intrinsic requirement throughout the business to identify opportunities that promote sustainability. So one of the key objectives, especially in my portfolio in the environmental space, is to ensure that the group preserves its natural resources and that we stabilize and minimize impact on the environment. So therefore, we try to partner with stakeholders and suppliers who are equally as passionate about plastic waste reduction to implement further initiatives to reduce plastic waste onto the landfill or on our oceans. So we've incorporated circular initiatives in some of our processes and even in our products. One highlight of a case study that we did is one of our suppliers, which produces furniture for our homeware store. They actually use substrates of LDPE plastics in their manufacturing processes. So we were able to collect plastic waste from our central DC. So whenever products are imported at the DC, there are certain plastics such as shrink wraps, LDPE polybags, bubble wraps, and so forth, which we have collected and sent through to the supplier to then use as a substrate to the product that they supply us, and then we sell in our stores. And from the inception of that project in 2023, we've diverted close to 23.6 tons of plastic waste from landfill into the supplier. We've also partnered with the various companies. There's a company that does micro recycling solutions, where they place micro recycling pods in communities and informal settlements, and they encourage communities and informal waste reclaimers to actually bring in any plastic waste within the community. And what they do with their plastic is that they obviously shred it into various substrates and then pull it into molds. What we did is we identify a mold which is able to mold into footwear hangers, which we've used in our Mr. Price sports division. And then we've also partnered with an NGO that does a lot of waste litter boom through their river collections. And there as well, they use a lot of informal waste reclaimers, where they collect all the waste in our rivers, especially upstream, because that's where the source is. And then from there, we identify any waste that is still in recyclable conditions, which we're able to use in our products. So there are also other projects which I can get to a bit later in the chat.
Thanks, that's really interesting. Just super quickly, just to build on that, what really impressive stuff. What led Mr. Price Group to focus on the areas of work that you've just identified? What were the kind of main levers that made you focus on the different programs you've mentioned?
Thanks, Mark. As you mentioned earlier, as a business that is based out in South Africa, we're based in Durban, which is quite close to the coast. So we are passionate about reducing our impact on plastic pollution on the ocean. And as a result, the group identified key performing indicators which targeted plastic reduction, recyclability of products, and reuse of products. So beyond the importance of delivering on stakeholder expectations, such as investor interest, regulatory compliance, reducing waste, or even cost saving, sustainability resonates with the key values of the business as well, which is value, passion, and partnership. So the business requires also natural and social capital to operate, which sustainability embeds on. And in terms of our operations and supplies and supply chains and company, it's also important for us to make sure that we have a positive impact on the environment and our society. And also, if I may also add, in South Africa, the informal waste sector constitutes the majority of the waste collection. And with the regulations such as EPR, which mandates a shift towards more of a formal structure in the informal sector, and it recognizes the importance of the informal waste reclaimers. So business also needs to play their part in assisting governments and informal waste reclaimers to be a part of this formal process of recycling and circularity.
Great, thank you. And then if I can turn to you and get your perspectives based on the work at Reverse Resources, really around the practical tools which exist to help companies firstly identify and knowledge these kind of workers, informal workers in circular supply chains, and also to help understand some of the associated risks.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark, and thanks for inviting me to attend. I mean, our specialism is very much within the textile only part of the circular economy. We do a lot of work in Bangladesh. However, we try and always lead with the business case. And how can we find business cases to, encourage transformation? And I think Andeli just mentioned it really nicely there, reflected really nicely about the role of businesses looking into these circular value chains because of, as Ines was saying, that I like the way she said waste moments, because I often describe it waste generated, grey box, recycled product. And what happens in that grey box is kind of anybody's game, and it changes between high levels of informality or corruption, basically, to just, low levels of informality or who knows what goes on in that grey box. And so to kind of make those step-by-step changes and bringing this into the actual circular value chains is what we focus on. So we don't look at the risk so much as on the opportunity, and setting up practical kind of like steps towards continual improvement. So for example, with the waste handlers we work with in Bangladesh and India and others, we've tested out and now beginning to scale up what we call the RR Network certificate for waste handlers, which says 3 basic things, quite small things really, but actually quite impactful within the scope of this sort of sector. So we basically say this network says that this company has a permits, it is paying some tax. It says that they have good processes. So the waste is set on things like the waste is set on planks, on pallets, so it doesn't get wet or moldy. Simple things like that. That's on process, and we assess on traceability, which is of course using our platform, because at core we are actually a tech company, although quite atypical in many ways. And then also on what we call entry-level compliance or human rights, which is, have they brought some fire extinguishers, and have we assessed that there's no child labour under 14? There's no forced and bonded labour, and really key critical basic things. But just that actually is incredibly useful for a lot of companies. It gives brands the confidence to kind of encourage.
Oh, are we losing Nin? Is that just
waste
me?
handlers, and also give. Oh, am I back again?
Yes, sorry, Nin. It might just be my connection. I hope, but please continue.
Okay, no problem. Well, I hope I didn't drop out for too long, but yeah, so it's trying to create a little bit of a level, even out the playing field, because you have some organizations working in this waste industry that are wanting to invest in better wages, that are wanting to invest in better conditions, better facilities. But of course, there's other companies who are not doing those investments who can then undercut them. So we need to be able to promote those good actors and provide a business case for them to continually improving the work that they're doing. And that's really the focal point of the work that we do.
Thanks so much, Nin. That's great, and really interesting to, both in terms of highlighting the business case element, but also some really kind of practical insights there. George, turning to you now. So we know obviously a lot of this work, the work in the sector is informal, and often therefore there's a lot of push to formalize the kind of work that we're talking about today. But in doing so, there's also the risk that we exclude the very people who rely on informal work to survive. So just to get a few thoughts from your side around how do we navigate that tension between, pushing to formalize, but also making sure that in doing so, we don't exclude informal workers that we're ultimately trying to support.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I think the examples from Andili and Nin kind of begin to illustrate this a little bit. And I really like Nin's analogy of this kind of grey box of recycling. We just don't know what goes on in a lot of cases, and I think that's part of the challenge. As you say, there have been examples where attempts at formalization, not necessarily within circularity, but within other supply chains, attempts at formalization have led to vulnerable people who depended upon that informal sector kind of losing out on those income earning opportunities, which may have been, may come with all kinds of challenges in terms of working conditions, and pay may be very low, but for a lot of very vulnerable communities, they're still supporting whole families and extended families with that employment. So I think it's really important that any attempts to undertake formalization are done very carefully. And it's quite hard to generalize, I suppose. I think because of this kind of the grey box nature of a lot of this stuff, I think it will look different for different supply chains and different contexts. And if I go back to Gayang's example, I think those two examples of textile waste recycling, obviously where Reverse Resources are working as well, in comparison to lead acid battery recycling, I think that the contrast between those two is quite illuminating. So I think Reverse Resources, for example, demonstrate that a certain amount of formalization can happen within the textile recycling space in Bangladesh, and that can lead to improved working conditions, as Nin's described. My sense is that in those kind of contexts where it is achievable, what we need is to ensure that supply chain players make a long-term commitment to that formalization process. It's not going to happen overnight, and there's going to be bumps in the road. Challenges are going to emerge. Kind of new levels of knowledge will be achieved, and it's really important, I think, that the supply chain partners stay the course and work together to resolve those challenges rather than step away when the going gets tough, because I think it will get tough. And I met with some of Nin's colleagues in Bangladesh last month, and it was really illuminating talking to them about the challenges that they face in that sector in Bangladesh. So I think, yeah, there are challenges along the way. So long-term commitment is really important. I think to the point about the tension between formalization and protecting livelihoods, it's really important to understand the local, very context-specific socioeconomic and sociocultural drivers of informality. So as Gayang said, the informal sector is a large chunk of the economy in so many parts of the world, but often it's supplying employment to people who would struggle to enter formal employment in the current kind of setup. So it's really important to understand the barriers that those people face and work to overcome those barriers in a way that enables them to benefit from the gradual formalization of these opportunities. And I think partnership is really key in that. So I think it can be quite challenging for business enterprises to have the level of kind of deep contextual knowledge that enables them to understand those drivers. And therefore, I think partnership with civil society, with local trade unions is really important. And there are great examples of civil society who have the expertise in this process of formalization. And there are great examples in the trade union context, people like Sewa in India, for example. So I think those kind of principles around long-term commitment and understanding drivers and local socioeconomic context and partnership are really helpful for the textile type examples. But if we contrast that with the lead acid batteries, I think also, as Gayang hinted at, there is a need for better enforcement of regulation. and better law enforcement. So when I was in Bangladesh, I also met with some organizations working in that space, perhaps most notably Pure Earth, who've done fantastic work on lead acid battery recycling and lead poisoning kind of globally. And it's quite frightening. I mean, hearing about these working conditions, the level of hazards for workers is very extreme. So, you know, Gayeng talked about kind of lead poisoning and its effects on children. So in these kind of informal setups where lead batteries are being recycled, you know, whole swathes of kind of the local area, the soil and the waterways is being contaminated with extremely toxic chemicals. And quite frighteningly, the guys at Pure Earth were saying to me, like, the workforce is in effect disposable. Workers who are recycling the lead in these batteries often will only work for 2 to 4 months, and then the poisoning is overwhelming, and they're too unwell. They're so sick they cannot continue to work. So this is extremely hazardous. And I think in those kind of situations, a kind of long-term commitment to formalization really isn't what's needed. Actually, what we need is much better law enforcement and actually, to be frank, closing down of those facilities with local government and local civil society working together to find alternative employment opportunities for those workers, because the conditions are just so dangerous. So for me, this idea of the grey box is really important. And I think perhaps the first thing that we need to do in all these different supply chains that are moving in the direction of circularity is kind of taking the lid off that grey box and really understanding what's going on there in the first place, because the solutions will be different for different supply chains in different contexts.
Great, thanks, George. So I'm going to squeeze in one question before a more panel question before we go to the Q&A. Probably this one might be for you, Gayeng, but others please come in. So, you know, having heard some of the challenges, you know, thought more through how we formalize properly in a way that respects the rights of workers in informal supply chains. What kind of practical steps can and should companies focus then on to, you know, to navigate challenges around certainly around transparency and some of the issues we've discussed already? So, Gayeng, any thoughts from your side on that?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And I think, you know, it's great to have that alignment here at the panel that, you know, formalization is not the only way to go, but there's different ways to formalize the setting. And I think that's where the definition needs to be clear, or we have clarity as an organization, what does formalized setting means. And frankly, what we see on the ground at times is that there are different parts to formalization. So for example, like training, increasing that knowledge, that can be formalized for the informal sector, for them to acknowledge, understand what are the working conditions that they're exposed to, what are some of the protection that they require. So there are some of the steps that we need to know what are the gaps that are obviously that are violating their rights, so in order to address the working conditions for the informal workforce. And the other thing that we found, that we've been working with some of the brands, but in discussion around how to have this formalized setting, is also how to work with the local workforce. Like George said, you have to understand that local context, because it's too idealistic to think that we could have a formal employment. But then there is this growth, and we're seeing this creativity around like social entrepreneur, where they still are in the informal workforce, but working with the government, with the private and the social actors to think about how to creatively allow these informal workforce still be nimble and still able to work the way they kind of want to, but then allow them to have this still a sustainable livelihoods with this entrepreneurship around the work that they do, and giving them that purpose, and then having obviously some kind of ways to make sure that they're being registered and being looked after, able to looked after. So I guess just to final summarization is that knowing your supply chain, understanding who these actors are, because it's often very fragmented, especially in this waste management side of the informal sector. And then truly understanding why they are here to fill the gap, because often we do see that there's just that great interplay between the formal actors and the informal actors when it comes to especially the waste management by the informal waste pickers. So I just want to end with that.
Thanks so much, Gang. Okay, great. So we've got a few questions coming in, which is fantastic. Please do share more in the Q&A section if you have them. But firstly, actually, before I go to that, I'm going to pass across to you, Nin, for a quick thought in that from your side, and then let's go to Q&A.
Yeah, I'd love to just follow on from what Gang said. Yes, local context is really important. And we always approach everything with like a journey towards, you know, step by step, continual small improvements. But I would also counter some of what was said, especially in the textile sector, because there is now an increasing demand from these new recycling technologies entering the market that need a very different type of industry to source the waste from. We're moving from recyclers, like big mechanical recyclers do 1,000 tons a month, 12,000 tons a year. We're talking to chemical recyclers, some are smaller, but some are going up to 200 and 250,000 tons a year. That's a very different supply chain. And a lot of these waste handlers aren't ready to supply to that kind of industry. So there is a need as well, in order to scale recycling, especially in textiles, to actually really radically change the structure and formalize this, because of these large companies can't source from informal sector as it is right now. And I understand there's a tension there, but if we don't also push and promote those actors that want to formalize, then we also prohibit the scaling of those recycling technologies that we all really need to be working and recycling all of our textile.
Thanks. Thank you for that. It's actually, I think the scale issue is super important. Great. So let's switch across then to a few questions that have come in. So Andile, I'm going to start with you. So one question here is, are the community recycling hubs you mentioned remunerating those who are contributing waste? And otherwise, what's the incentive for waste collectors to go there? If it's okay to take that one.
Yep. Thanks, Mark. So traditionally, there are different incentives for the informal waste collectors. As we all know, there are waste buyback centers. But for these specific projects, and the one I'll focus on is the one in the community that the question referred to. So whenever they set up the micro recycling pods, the company, what they do is, instead of having cash, just to minimize the risks of theft, obviously, for their workers and of the community members, is that they work with local shops within the area where they create coupons that whenever a community member or informal waste recycler collects a certain amount, they're able to substitute that waste for a coupon, and that coupon they can either use to purchase, you know, the essential needs, bread, milk, buy airtime, which becomes quite essential as well these days. So that's one of the ways that informal waste pickers and the community members get incentivized. And then in terms of the river waste collection, in that case, it's usually on a contractual basis, because there are various rivers and streams that get worked on different times. And there's also other projects such as beach cleanups, which will be done during that period. So that would be another way where the informal waste collectors or reclaimers are incentivized.
Thanks, Andile. Another question, and then you touched on this a little bit already, but what models of collaboration do we need to achieve the scale necessary to address risks in circular supply chain? So we've noted the need around scale, but what and how can collaboration fit in? What models have we seen already, or what models do we need to get to the scale that we've just acknowledged?
I think it's really important to accept and reflect that we aren't in a perfect system right now, and that there isn't enough waste handlers that can meet the code of conducts that some of these large-scale chemical recyclers would like to be sourcing from. So there needs to be an understanding that there should be what we call a journey towards compliance, and to kind of value more the speed of progress rather than where people are today. So if somebody has been, you know, you can track that they've been really making really regular commitments and improving the work and the working conditions of their staff in the last year, maybe they should actually be valued at the same level as somebody who is already, you know, got a bit further than them, so that it kind of opens the pool and again builds the business case and a reason. And otherwise, what can happen as well, if we don't have this more timescale and sort of more flexible approach to it, then you end up just focusing, which is I think what George was kind of driving at. What we don't want to come is like some big multinationals building these big waste collection centers. Yes, they are paying good wages, but it doesn't allow for that entrepreneurship and for those local companies to really start growing into better companies. So we need to kind of level the playing fields a little bit there as well, to encourage them to scale and grow, rather than just plonk new businesses on top of what's already there.
Thanks so much for that. Another quick one. What's the current state of research on this topic? Have the risk associated with informal recycling across different sectors, textile aside, been fully identified, or where are the gaps? Where do we need further insights and more research? So maybe Guy, that's one for you initially, but others please come in. George, perhaps as well.
Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, at the center, we are a social enterprise consultancy, so we do work where client pay us. So it'll be so to be honest, we want to work more with businesses to look at this problem, but we have been doing increasingly more. So we also looked at other one around paper. And as I mentioned, the lead-acid batteries was one. To be honest, though, we do find there's these nuances around the informal waste picker, the why they fall into this workforce and what are some of the working conditions. They're actually quite similar, unfortunately, but it's all you know, obviously our focus is very much around the human rights and the child rights around in these supply chains. But frankly, like the points that I mentioned in the PowerPoint, they exist for a reason, which is where the interplay around the formal sector, and often what Ines mentioned is this, where see that there is this lack of you know, motivations to really have a transformation around the circularity in terms of production, etc. But yes, we hope we're going to do more, but I think some of the common issues, I mean, some of the issues are quite common across different industries.
Thanks so much, Gang. We are nearly at the hour, but George, any super quick thoughts from you on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the level of research does vary a lot across the different supply chains and sectors, and I think this points to the fact that this is quite context specific, and perhaps textiles is an area where we've seen more attention. Just if it's okay, I'll just go back to the previous question, because I think that's a really important one, and just building on what Nin was saying there, I think that there's this need for long-term partnerships that are both kind of horizontal within local context, but also vertical through the supply chain. And I think Andile's examples from Mr. Price Group were great examples of retailers, brands working with their suppliers together, as well as working with local community organizations, working with recyclers and informal waste handlers locally. So I think that kind of vertical, horizontal kind of model is helpful. I think also just picking up on Nin's point about the need to be flexible and to value kind of progression in the right direction, and not necessarily the kind of perfect state that we're quite far from in these supply chains. I think a really great quotation that I picked up at a conference a couple of months ago, which was not referring specifically to circularity, but to human rights due diligence in supply chains more generally, is that in reality, there are no perfect supply chains, but there are improving supply chains. And what we need to be doing is working with the improving supply chains and acknowledging that. I think both Andile and Nin's examples really illustrate that. Yeah.
That's a great quote. I'm not going to beat that. So with that, thanks so much to all of you on the panel for conversation. Thanks everyone for your questions. And I think it's back to Giles for a few thoughts from your side.
Well, look, just a massive thank you. I don't want to hold anyone for long. This issue is going to stay with us. It is going to grow. I mean, there were really helpful references before to legislation. I think in public opinion and reputation as well, there will only be more onus over time on brands for what happens to their products after they're life of use. And so this is an area where we really all need to learn more. I hope we can collaborate more in future. It would be brilliant if we can, from the start, make sure that we're collaborating to try and design these chains so that we don't make some of the mistakes we saw in previous ones. But there, as we've had today, there's a huge long way to go. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to the Centre for sharing the expertise on this, and to the other panelists. Great to see Andile as another ETI member, and brilliant contributions from Guy and Nin as well. So thank you to everybody. Thank you for bearing with us. And we're a minute over, which is not really too bad. And we hope to see you all soon. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.